Hello and welcome. Today we'll be exploring the Itinerant Videogame Museum here in Brazil. As the name suggests, this museum moves from city to city, typically staying for about 2 weeks before heading to the next location. They currently have more than 400 consoles in the collection, ranging from a replica of the brown box to the PlayStation 5 and a prototype Xbox Series X. So just to be clear, this isn't going to be an in-depth video covering every single console in detail, but rather a tour of the museum and a brief history about how video games evolved in Brazil, what were the main challenges, and how it shaped our gaming culture. I'll split the video into 3 chapters. First, we'll explore how gaming progressed through different generations and highlight the most important home consoles in Brazil. Then, in the second chapter, we'll focus on Brazilian-made consoles as well as some unusual models in the collection, and finally I'll wrap things up by talking about the museum itself, how it operates, how long it's been around, and what events take place during their visits. And throughout the video, I'll try to show as much of their collection as possible, so if you find a console from your childhood or that you haven't seen in a while, make sure to let me know in the comments. To understand how video games evolved in Brazil and how the gaming culture was shaped, it's important to be aware of 4 key pillars, and before the end of this chapter I will tell you about each of those. But first, let's start from the very beginning. Here they have a replica of the famous brown box, and eventually its commercial evolution, the Odyssey, released in 1972. The Odyssey did make its way to a few Brazilian stores in 1975, but it wasn't widely available and was far too expensive for most people. In 76 we had another important release, the Fairchild Channel F, the first console to use cartridges. Until then, games were hard-coded into the console, but now players could swap cartridges and buy new games separately. That same year, we would finally see a Brazilian console called Telejogo, created by Philco Ford. It was a simple Pong-style console with 3 games to choose from, and it was quite a success. So much so that just 3 years later, the Telejogo 2 would arrive, now with 10 available games and 2 detachable controllers. It was back when video games were still called TV games, essentially something else for you to do with your TV. Just to keep tabs on what was going on at the time, Nintendo released their first console called TV Game, which was available only in Japan. By this point, the Atari VCS, later known as the 2600, was picking up steam, as developers were getting used to the system and coming up with really interesting games, so it's time to introduce the first pillar. From the 70s until the late 80s, Brazil had very strict import policies, and that would even extend to regulations that would only allow tech companies to operate in Brazil if they were predominantly owned by Brazilians, which in turn pushed away all the American, European, and Japanese video game companies of that era. So what happens when a country that wants to play video games can't legally play video games? Well, there were 2 main paths. One was the grey market, which lasted for decades, and the other, much more interesting, was the rise of homemade clones of existing consoles. The issue with the imported Ataris is that they wouldn't be able to display colors on Brazilian TVs, which used a different system. The solution would come from local tech shops who would install a small circuit on the console to fix this issue. And it wouldn't take long for the first clones, such as the Video Computer System, Dactari, and Dynavision to show up in the country. Some of these companies, such as Canal 3 and Dynavision, even began manufacturing their own cartridges, which could be rented or purchased. 1983 will be a really important year in Brazil's gaming history. While the US was in the middle of its video game crash, Brazil would surprisingly look like an attractive market. It was in that year that we finally saw the official release of 2 major consoles, the Odyssey brought in by Philips and the Atari 2600 manufactured by Polivox, a subsidiary of Gradiente, and remember that name for later. Even though it's called just Odyssey, it was actually based on the 1978 model, but as the first one was never released here, there was no need to label it as the second version. Initially the Odyssey had strong sales, but when the Polivox Atari hit the shelves, it quickly became the dominant console. Now let's pick up the pace and move to another generation. By the mid-80s, after all the crazy innovations, successes, and failures of the previous years, things would calm down a bit in the 8-bit era. There were some wild consoles out there, but the scene would be dominated by 2 Japanese brands, Nintendo and Sega. As usual, we wouldn't have consoles released here on day 1, and clones would be the first ones to appear, but things were about to change. Not only in the console realm, but even politically speaking. In 85, Brazil would return to being a democracy and would have a new constitution by 88. But before we move any further, I feel like it's time to introduce 2 other key aspects which are closely intertwined. First, video games, especially the new ones, were always incredibly expensive for most Brazilians, as well as games and accessories. This leads us to a defining aspect of Brazilian game culture. Generations don't mean much. Consoles had to last way longer than just a typical 4 to 6 years, and at times they wouldn't even be available in the country until a few years later. Most players are 1 or even 2 generations behind, and most people couldn't afford to have multiple consoles. That is why the retro gaming scene is so strong in Brazil, because by the time the PlayStation 2 and GameCube were the latest and greatest, many people were still playing on the Master System or Super Nintendo. Another key aspect when it comes to accessibility was the rise of rental stores and, most importantly, LAN houses, which is not the perfect translation, but for the sake of this video, that's what I'm going to call it. It was a place where you would pay to play video games. They were really popular from the 80s to the late 90s, and you'd find them in all different sizes, from well-equipped businesses to small setups with a few consoles in someone's garage. But that meant that even if you couldn't afford a console, you'd still be able to play many hours per week as well as play on different systems. But as a fresh democracy, things would take a while to change for video games, and once again, gray market and clones would be the way to bring the new consoles to the country. The first NES clone will be made by Gradiente. After their success with the Atari 2600, they decided to come up with the Phantom system, which was a really interesting and well-made console. It used an Atari 7800 shell and a Mega Drive controller layout, but would play NES games. And it wouldn't take long for other clones to grace the market as well, such as the Top Game, Beat System, Dynavision 2, and the infamous Polystation. But a small Brazilian company called Tectoy was about to change things up. They managed to get the licensing rights of the Master System and would officially bring the console in the country in '89, 4 years after its official release in Japan, along with a huge marketing campaign. That would prove to be a huge success, and at least officially the Master System would dominate the Brazilian market with no official competition from Nintendo, but having a market filled with NES clones. The success of the Master System paved the way for Tectoy to bring the Mega Drive to Brazil just 1 year later, but it doesn't mean that the Master System would stop being sold. In fact, to this day, you can still buy a brand new Master System, and in 2017, Tectoy even released a special Mega Drive to celebrate 30 years of its partnership with Sega. By the early 90s, Brazil's market had opened up a bit more, making it slightly less difficult to import consoles. The gray market was still thriving, and this is how the Super Nintendo and the first units of the Mega Drive initially made their way into the country. Finally, in '93, Nintendo made its official entry into the market. Playtronic, a Gradiente subsidiary, began manufacturing both the NES and the Super Nintendo in Brazil, quite late in its life cycle, but both were widely available in the gray market or via clones in the NES case. Still, the Tectoy-Sega partnership was a huge hit and the Master System and Mega Drive were a huge success in the country, but things were about to change in the following generation. As we move from 2D to 3D, it's time to introduce the final pillar, which has been part of our history since the beginning: piracy. Piracy had always existed to some degree, especially in the form of clones and knockoff cartridges, but the CDs on the PlayStation 1 would completely change things. Even though the PS1 was never officially released in Brazil, the import market was much more open in the mid-90s and you could easily find it. So if you were a parent looking out for a console, you had two choices: a cartridge-based system or the highly uncommon Sega Saturn, where you'd probably afford like 3 games per year, or a widely available modded PlayStation 1 with games that would cost a small fraction of the price. I'm not saying that was the only reason why the PS1 was so popular here, because it obviously had an incredible library, but that certainly played a role. It also explains why there wasn't a huge interest on the Nintendo 64 and Saturn, even though both consoles were officially released in Brazil. Clones of current-gen consoles were no longer a thing by this time, but older systems still had a place in the market. Updated versions of the Master System, Mega Drive, and Super Nintendo clones remained available, especially for those who couldn't afford the newer, more expensive consoles. The move to the 6th gen reminds me of that saying that history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And once again, the modded PlayStation 2 and, to a lesser degree, the modded Xbox would be the winners. That would also pave the way for modded versions of popular games, with GTA and Winning Eleven standing as the biggest examples. On a personal note, I didn't have much luck with the PlayStation 2, and both a fat model and a slim version had issues, so I ended up getting an Xbox towards the end of that generation, and being able to play Doom 3 and Half-Life 2 on a console in 2005 was a wild experience. The 7th generation saw a shift in Brazil's gaming market as companies began to take the country more seriously. By 2010, both the PS Triple and the Xbox 360 would be officially released in Brazil, not through a third-party company but by Sony and Microsoft themselves. This meant slightly lower prices for consoles and games, as well as localized versions including voiceovers in Portuguese, unless we're talking about the Wii, and to this day translations are not that common in Nintendo games. The Xbox 360 became the most popular console of this generation, and would be the most popular console in Brazil for a good number of years, with the PlayStation 3 coming in second place. During this generation, consoles became much more connected, with online gaming and social features becoming core aspects of the experience. That kinda diminished the appeal of piracy, even though it was still present, especially on the 360. The 8th generation marked a significant milestone for Brazil. Both the PlayStation 4 and the Xbox One were released in the country with almost no delay compared to the rest of the world. But Nintendo continued to lag behind, with the Wii U and later the Switch taking a few years to arrive after the US launch. That generation would play a bit similar to how it did worldwide. The PlayStation 4 would dominate sales and the Wii U would be a huge failure, but the Xbox One would still have a decent player base coming in from the strong numbers pulled by the Xbox 360. And although the Switch is likely the most successful Nintendo console in the country in over a decade, especially due to its low price point, the expensive games, lack of Portuguese voiceovers, and absence of a Game Pass type of deal push people away. Today, as we move into the current generation, it's clear that the PlayStation 5 is the most popular console in Brazil, but again, I would say that the balance is not as drastic as in Japan or Europe, especially because price is always an important component, and the Series S is the cheapest current-gen console, and Game Pass is really important if you want to save some money. To wrap things up, a survey from last year reinforces the idea that generations last much longer in Brazil than in other parts of the world, as affordability and availability play a huge role in gaming culture here. The PlayStation 4 remains the most popular home console, followed by the Xbox 360 in second place and the PlayStation 5 in third. But what's perhaps most surprising is the console that came in fourth place, the PlayStation 2. Now, when it comes to portables, especially the famous ones, there is an additional challenge. Not only they were expensive, but the appeal of a portable console is, well, to be able to play it anywhere you want. But the idea of playing games on the go isn't as appealing in a country with certain security concerns. And when you combine that with the fact that most people couldn't afford to have multiple consoles, when given the choice between one or the other, most would settle for the home console. That's not to say that portables were completely absent. The Game Gear found some success, and the Game Boy was officially released in Brazil in '94, and you'd always have a cousin or a couple of friends who had a Game Boy or a DS, but it never reached the same level of popularity as home consoles. The evolution of gaming in Brazil, from the punk days up until the current generation, wasn't easy. It was marked by many different challenges, from expensive prices to availability issues to language barriers. But we do like our video games, so we had to be creative and persistent. And if by chance you're a game developer or publisher, make sure to localize the price for Brazil and translate the game into Portuguese, because you will find a loyal and passionate audience. Now, it's time to focus a bit more on Brazilian consoles as well as some unusual models in the collection. I'll first talk about the Brazilian ones, then move to the uncommon or most curious, and to make things easier, I'll try to progress by release year. One of the rarest consoles in the collection in terms of number of units is the TV Game It was a do-it-yourself project featured in the Brazilian magazine Nova Eletrônica, where readers were taught how to assemble the console themselves. It was a Pong-style console that played 3 games. Next up is the Onyx Jr., initially intended to be a ColecoVision clone, which explained why its controllers are shaped that way, but ended up as an Atari 2600 clone instead. It has a very unique trait that sets it apart from other clones, a pause button. We also have to talk about the Splice Vision, the world's first ColecoVision clone. It was a bold and interesting project, but too expensive for the time and ended up being discontinued in just 2 years, but I've been told it's become a well thought out console and goes for a pretty penny these days. The collection also includes 3 different models of the Dactar 007, which is an Atari 2600 clone that comes in this James Bond style case, and I have to say I kinda want one. Here we can see an MSX Expert XP800, it sounds like a printer, doesn't it? But it could play games such as Castlevania and Metal Gear, and it was relatively successful in Brazil, where it was released by a company you must be familiar by now, Gradiente. Remember when I said that generations don't matter much in Brazil and that the Mega Drive would continue on the shelves for a long time? Well, let me introduce you to the Mega Drive 4 Guitar Idol. Released at the height of the Rock Band and Guitar Hero success, it would come with a guitar controller and scratch that musical itch for a much smaller price. I've never played it, but I've been told it works quite well. Another interesting and ambitious project is the Zibo, a 7th gen console released by Tectoy and Qualcomm, designed as an affordable option for emerging markets. It was also released in Mexico. Instead of using cartridges or CDs, the Zibo relied on the 3D network to download games. But at that price point, a PlayStation 2 was much more interesting, and sadly the Zibo will be discontinued just 2 years after launch. We also had some interesting portables which aim to be more budget friendly. The one that I'm going to highlight in this video is the Tectoy Show do Milhão, sort of our Who Wants to Be a Millionaire TV show. Its famous presenter just passed away a few weeks ago. Now let's check some foreign models as well. The Wonder Mega M2 is a hybrid Mega Drive and Sega CD that would come with wireless controllers quite ahead of its time. They also have a Super Famicom box, which is on loan to the museum. It was used in Japanese hotels and you'd have to insert coins to be able to play. They also have a couple of Argentine consoles, such as the Magiclick Teleclick with its controller being made out of a calculator shell, and the Telematch Panoramic, a clone of the original Odyssey but it wouldn't come with the overlays. Lastly, let's check some weird looking portables of all sizes, shapes, and prices. Finally, let's talk about the museum itself now. It started 13 years ago with the personal collection of its founder, Cleidson Lima, and it was the first of its kind in Brazil. Over the years, the museum's collection grew, not only through acquisitions but also through donations both large and small, as well as rare consoles that are loaned for exhibition. They currently have 453 consoles, from a replica of the brown box to the current gen, covering more than 50 years of video game history. They have been to 19 different states and had more than 20 million visitors over those years. The operating hours change a bit from venue to venue, but at least here they were open from 3 PM to 9 PM. What remains consistent is that it's all free of charge for the visitors. There are over 50 consoles plugged in and ready to play, including true racing setups and 2 VR units, as well as daily tournaments that range from Smash Bros. And Mortal Kombat to EAFC and Guitar Hero. There is also a cosplay tournament and a Just Dance Legacy competition. The museum's staff is responsible for maintaining the collection, ensuring that everything stays in good condition, and handling any necessary repairs, such as fixing controllers for the playable consoles. Each console on display includes a paper sign with historical information, so even if you explore the exhibition on your own, you can still learn about each system. Overall, it's a great experience. For some, it's a way to revisit your childhood, and for others, it's a chance to introduce a younger generation to the rich history of gaming. And it's a good reminder that limitations often lead to different solutions, and that even though gaming is so often frowned upon, it has a rich history, filled with creativity, innovation, and most importantly, collaboration. And it's also a way to keep video games accessible, as it's free of charge for visitors, which aligns perfectly with how video games have evolved in the country. It also shows how video games are able to transcend borders and language barriers. That wraps up my visit to the Itinerant Videogame Museum, and I hope I was able to offer a small glimpse into how video games evolved in Brazil, and some of the challenges we had to overcome and others that we continue to face today. I'd like to thank Thiago Moreira, the museum coordinator, for the great reception, Rayel, the museum manager, for the very insightful tour around the collection, and last but not least, Mrs. Pixels, who helped record some of the footage you've seen during this video. I'll leave some extra links and credits in the description in case you want to go a bit further into our gaming history. I know this wasn't a super in-depth year-by-year history, but if this video does well and there's enough interest in a more detailed version, especially about the 70s and 80s, let me know in the comments, but that's it for today. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing, leaving a like, and sharing your thoughts in the comments. If you'd like to support the channel even further, you can also become a member. Have a great day, and I'll see you in the next video.